The term psychedelic means mind or soul manifesting. It comes from the Greek psyche, meaning mind or soul, and delios, meaning to reveal or to manifest. So together you have these mind manifesting drugs. There's a fun little historical story there around how this term came up and a conversation between Aldous Huxley and Canadian psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond, but I'll leave that to your Googling because I don't remember the exact quote and I didn't write it down. I don't want to mess it up. But generally, that's what the term psychedelic means. And it is applied to a group of psychoactive compounds that produce altered states of consciousness, or what you would call trips or journeys. Now, when I say altered state of consciousness, anything we take alters our state of consciousness. Like I am drinking a coffee right now. This is altering my state of consciousness. If I were to consume nicotine, alter my state of consciousness. Cannabis, alter my state of consciousness. Alcohol, alter my state of consciousness. So when I say that they alter our state of consciousness, I mean this in a pretty unique and interesting way. It is not as though we just sort of like shift into sort of different kind of like subtle nuances in our normal state, or even more significant nuances in the case of alcohol, for example. I'm talking about entering into states of awareness, states of consciousness that differ at times so dramatically from our baseline awareness, baseline state of being, that they become nearly unrecognizable to what we would experience as reality in baseline. So, what I mean by this is there are aesthetic alterations, there are alterations in how we see things. Color can become more intense, the play of light and shadow can become more intense, but then visually more things can happen, what's called open or closed eyes visuals, where all of a sudden we start to see patterns or colors in empty space. Behind our closed eyes, we might see all sorts of sort of a visual play of material. It could be very metaphorical, like scenes, like watching a play unfold as if you were really there, or these highly complex sort of geometric images that, again, eyes close or eyes open. Sometimes, for example, if you see this photo here from Alex Gray, this painting from Alex Gray, one of my favorites, it's a really great example of how profound the visual alterations can be. This is a pretty good rendition of what it can be like when we're under a full effects of the visual alterations of psychedelics. Again, so we can have these subjective scenes in the mind's eye or these patterns. We also have experiences where, and we'll get in a little bit more about this in a bit, but we have the experience of the normal sort of invisible walls that temper our emotionality, keep content normally reserved for the subconscious or unconscious mind sort of down. These walls can dissolve, and things that we hold within us that normally we can't access or won't access or don't access come to the forefront of awareness in ways that can be quite intense, quite sort of full bodied, literally, but also in the sense of fully immersive. And this can be memories, like I said, scenes, and they can even at some points go beyond what feels to be personal memories. There are experiences people can have where they enter into states of consciousness where they experience what seems like memories of other people or whole cultures or whole species or the whole arc of evolution on this planet, as though that individual was living it out as their subjective experience. The entire arc of evolution on this planet is their subjective experience happening within a moment or a few moments or an arc in their psychedelic experience. There's also the possibility to, in these experiences, have what's called a mystical or a spiritual experience, where one genuinely has the sense of connecting with a greater power. The sense of, say, for the term God, for example, or universe or spirit or etc. People have a direct, genuine, authentic, at least experientially, connection with this force in the universe, whatever it might be. And these tend to be very powerful, meaningful experiences. Another thing that psychedelics can do, which is quite interesting, is what's called sort of self, like the dissolution of the self, or ego dissolution or ego death. Ego death is a pretty extreme term, but effectively what we're talking about here is when I said that psychedelics can dissolve the invisible walls that temper our emotionality and keep certain, internal content suppressed so that it does not necessarily too dramatically dilute or defer from our capacity to perceive like objective reality around us. One of the things it can dissolve is the sort of the model that's ongoingly operating within us that is our self-representation. The fact that I am a being, a James, for example, that has a particular sort of position of perspective. I know where I am and where other starts. I'm separate from this water bottle. I'm separate from this camera. I'm separate from the air around me or life on the other side of the planet or from the past or from the future. I'm separate from this. And I have a clear sense of who I am. I am me. I mean, it varies from day to day whether or not I have a clear sense of what that is. But I mean, we all have this general sense, if we're in a healthy state of mind, as having a solid me. At different levels of intensity and at different doses of different psychedelics, we can have the experience of the models that hold that self-representation together dissolving away. And it feels as though I am not me anymore, or me is gone. I am this bottle. I am this mic. I am you. I am life. I am all that has ever been all at once. We can have these experiences, and oftentimes during the experience, these are generally related to high mystical or spiritual type experiences. When we lose our sense of self, it goes away, and we encounter a connection with something greater than that we are also a part of, an expression of, and the totality of this larger force. But it can also feel like dying, because in a way, me is dying in that sense. It's dissolving away. So that's why it generally gets to be called ego death. This is something that's quite unique to psychedelic drugs, that they can do this. And so we'll talk a bit about why and how they do that, or at least what we understand about why and how they do that. But I want to clarify that these experiences can range. Even the sort of ego dissolution, ego softening, so on and so forth. It's not always so dramatic as I am dying and I am being, as I die, my sense of I is being reborn onto a larger force in the universe. It can be as subtle as the sort of like the confines, the strong grips that I have around who I identify as being can be softened such that new identities, new sort of models for how I understand myself can emerge. For example, how much I relate myself with nature, which we'll talk about with respect to psilocybin in a bit, or how much I hold on to a particular ideal, or how much of my identity is forged into a particular political ideology. These things can shift and change, like that aspect can soften. And so these are some of the kinds of experiences we can have. They can range from playful and recreational. They can go into the deeply therapeutic, because when we talk about these aesthetic things, when we talk about these aesthetic changes, they can be very interesting and curious. And a lot of psychedelic use is very much in the recreational sort of entertainment, camp. And I don't have any issues with that necessarily. It's not necessarily the safest way to do it, but there's a lot of playfulness. Even in therapeutic experience can be playfulness. When I talk about therapeutic, this is where with experiencing these memories or these old feelings or connecting with, a new way of understanding ourselves, or it allows us to undergo these, what people often call as like deeply healing experiences. And in the context of therapeutic support, and by this I mean a therapeutic facilitator or a ceremonial facilitator, we can deepen into those therapeutic aspects. It could also go as far as being profoundly spiritual, like I said before. They can range as well from acutely pleasant, like really pleasant, even like sexually, sensually pleasant, to extremely unpleasant, heightened states of anxiety, fear, panic, terror, hell without escape. This is how far, like merging into like sensual orgasmic union with the universe as we sort of like explode into everything in life and its absolute beauty to hellish, like hell with no escape, like infinite demonic suffering. Like they can go that far in their sort of valence. They can also have positive or negative consequences. We could have a really challenging experiences that have really positive consequences in our lives. We could have really positive experiences that have neutral consequences. We could have experiences that have negative consequences, such as harms that could come from it or confusing us or just like, so there's so much variability here. And whether or not the positive or negative outcome is not defined by the acute sort of experience. Like I said, negative outcomes can have positive consequences. And this is something else that's unique to psychedelics, which is that the effects are significantly mediated by contextual factors. What that means is that, if I take a Tylenol or if maybe it's paracetamol or wherever else, if I take acetaminophen, I know that I take this drug, it's going to have a particular effect. There might be some variation depending on my unique sort of genome and my physiology as to how it's going to affect me. But for the most part, it's going to be pretty stable. I'm going to take Tylenol, it's going to have a pain relieving effect. Or I'm going to drink alcohol and it's going to have an inebriating effect that is pretty, I might be more playful or more depressed depending on how I'm feeling and where I'm at. But for the most part, it's pretty stable. With psychedelics, the context, which would be our internal context or mindset context, what we're coming in with, what we believe about the psychedelics and narratives we have about these drugs or what they can offer us, and the concepts we have on board to understand our experiences, the feelings we're going in with, the history that we're going into with, that would be our internal context. And the external context, like where we are, who we're with, what's present or absent in the room, and then also the context of dose, the variability of how intense and like far out the experience can take us, also can be significantly mediated by how much the dose is. So these three factors, which are often called set, setting, and dose, they can have such wide-ranging differences that between different, outside of some universal characteristics that are pretty similar between each molecule, different people can have widely different experiences on totally different journey days. So it's heavily mediated by context. Whether or not it's going to be profoundly spiritual or just playful and recreational is something that you can reasonably sort of modulate by the context that you take it in. Now, that's not a hard line. Sometimes people take mushrooms at a festival and they meet God and their lives are changed. And sometimes people go into a ceremony to have a deeply spiritual experience and all they get is just like rehashing of all the reels that they consumed 3 or 4 days before. So it's not 100% definite, but it's true that they're highly mediated by context, unlike other drugs. The other thing that is interesting about psychedelics that is part of what, and we'll talk about in a second, defines them as psychedelics is that they tend to target predominantly, or at least the psychedelic effects, seems to predominantly be through their impact on what's called the serotonin 5-HT2A receptors, and that the modulation of those receptors seems to be responsible for the psychedelic effects, such as, like I said, I think I said alterations and aesthetic experience, so patterns, colors, also feelings. Part of what that is an increase of sensory awareness.